Okay, so this week's material, we're moving towards more financial and areas of young people's lives. Specifically, this week, we're looking at housing struggles and hopeful futures and talking to Julia Cook about her research. So can you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, so I'm Dr. Julia Cook. I'm a lecturer here at University of Newcastle in sociology as well. And my work is on young people, futures, housing, and money. So I'm very excited to share some of this material with you today.
So we're going to start with your kind of earlier work about the future. In the middle section, we're going to talk specifically more broadly about kind of the picture of housing and young people in Australia. And then the last bit, talk about your current research about intergenerational wealth transfers in families so young people can buy houses and the kind of interesting tensions and stuff that happen in that. So we'll start with work on the future. So as a reminder, in the course already, we've looked at the notions of figures of youth, and I've kind of spoken quite a bit about how young people kind of stand in for a kind of proxy of the future temporarily, and also in terms of like nostalgia for the past. This is kind of, moral panicky understanding that we need to fix young people so the future's good. So we've gone through that quite a bit. And in that paper, I talk a little bit about, for instance, some work me and some other colleagues did at Narrabri around land use, where we asked, farmers and locals and business people up there about whether there should be fracking in the area. And they started talking about, yes, there should be fracking because we need to have an industry for young people to kind of stay. And then others were saying, no, we can't have fracking because it kind of screws the land and that'll screw up the future for young people. So young people were in that research as the future, but were kind of manipulated on both sides, kind of to think about what the future is for their own arguments. So the future itself's been a really key way of thinking about thinking with the future in youth studies. And it's been really central to your work around young people's attitudes towards it, and particularly around hope.
Definitely, yes. So my work looks at how young people themselves view the future, how they relate to it. And I think a really interesting area to start when we're thinking about young people and futures from their own perspectives is taking a bit of a wider lens on it. So, zooming out and looking across history, just so that we can understand that time itself and views of the future are not something that's kind of natural or intrinsic. They are in many ways socially constructed. So the ways that we think about the future, they are determined by our social environments, our belief systems, the social norms around us. So I have an example of some of what this might look like on the screen here. So in the pre-modern era, we have a view of the future as a relatively closed horizon, meaning that the future was already in many ways viewed as being predetermined. This is a very kind of religious worldview. It was the sense that God and deities and such were kind of present in the world and could interact in the world and had a hand in determining how things played out. There was also a predictability to the future because of the social structure at the time. So if you were born a farmer and your father was a farmer, you're probably going to be a farmer. You're probably not going to be a merchant, and etc. So there was that kind of low social mobility, which breeds predictability and a sense of what your life is going to look like. And so time was viewed in a way that was more kind of cyclical rather than being, something that's kind of open to possibilities. But that changes a lot with the getting into the modern era. So we have, processes of industrialization, secularization, a kind of disenchantment and rationalization of the world. And we have this kind of emerging narrative of societies as kind of progressing over time rather than cyclical and continuous. And so this results in the future as a more kind of open horizon. So something that we can intervene in and determine ourselves to some degree. But, during this time, there's still not tremendously high social mobility. There's still relatively solid kind of social norms, a relatively normalized view of the life course. We had a predictable account of what a career might look like, or for women what the progress through like childbearing and such would look like. And there wasn't as much choice about those things as there is at present.
And that's got a picture too of like things are going to get better, progress, civilization, and has all that colonial stuff embedded in that as well.
Very
in that
much.
modern period. Why is the late modern now kind of period different?
Well, the late modern period, that is kind of characterized by a continuation of some of these processes. So a continuation of secularization, rationalization, all of those kind of things. But we start to see the contradictions in some of these things come out. So we start to see the narrative of progress kind of decline and fall down. We see that continual growth and progress is not necessarily possible if we're thinking about its impact on the natural world via things like environmental degradation, climate change. And so, we still have a relatively open view of the future, but now it's crowded with some kind of risks and concerns. So if we think about our current perspective, we're concerned about climate change. We're concerned about, whether our generation's going to have a similar kind of quality of living as our parents' generation. There's not really a sense that things are going to continue to get better so much anymore.
And that's relates to the fact as well, like current generations are starting to inherit a lower standard of living than previous generations, so it kind of bears out in that economic.
Definitely.
So what does that all mean for the research you were doing a few years ago about attitudes towards young people, young people's attitudes towards the future?
Well, I was really fascinated is when you look at the kind of research on kind of futures and then research on beliefs around climate change, there's some interesting contradictions. So the first one is that people tend to have a relatively optimistic view or even hopeful view of their own future and a relatively pessimistic view of a kind of larger scale future of the society around them. And I was trying to figure out, why is this the case? Like, we're clearly part of this society that we're so concerned about. So why is there this kind of discordant view? And then looking at the research on climate change as well, we know that even now, almost 10 years ago, a majority of Australians kind of held beliefs that there was, climate change is a real thing. It poses a risk to our way of life, to the natural environment, all of those things. But we know that these beliefs don't necessarily have an enormous impact on everyday behavior. And obviously, the picture's a bit more complicated than that, but nonetheless, there's an interesting contradiction there.
So the belief in something as huge as climate change and the worry about it doesn't necessarily correspond to kind of changes in behavior and practice. So it might, and cynically we kind of joke about how people might post something on Facebook about it or something's concern, but not actually stop taking 2 holidays overseas a year and stuff like that. So that's a kind of juxtaposition we're talking about there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So your work came up with a kind of way of thinking about this orientation towards the future in these different ways. So can you take us through that?
Yeah, so I was interested in how do we cope with our concerns about the future, and what kind of strategies do we use to reckon with the future? And so I adapted some work from Yen Sin, which looked at the strategies that people use to cope with risk and uncertainty, which I think the future is crowded with risk and uncertainty, so it's a good kind of schema. And essentially, Zin made the interesting point that we can't really divide our strategies for coping into rational strategies based on evidence and non-rational strategies based on just kind of blind faith or just hoping against hope. There's also when we're dealing with something as kind of imprecise and difficult as the future, there's also kind of strategies that have an element of both. So there's strategies such as kind of trust, intuition, emotion, some kind of aspects of hope. And I think those in-between strategies come up a lot when you're talking to people about their concerns about the future, because it's difficult to make pragmatic kind of rational action, but it's also not always tremendously helpful to just completely avoid the situation.
Yep. And so I think this kind of mechanism of categorizing things still works quite well for more recent times, things like the rise of QAnon and all this kind of stuff as well. How you can see it's like, in a way, non-rational coping strategies for many of the kind of things that are going on around them.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, so here we have from your research some young people talking about this stuff. So if you want to take us through some of that.
Yeah, so this is from some interviews that I did with young adults in Melbourne. These interviews were conducted back in 2014. And so just speaking to these young people about their views of the future, when they were talking about the kind of societal future, large-scale future, they were kind of relatively pessimistic. So we have people saying things such as, they're concerned about pollution, the availability of food, availability of everything, and they see these news kind of websites, and they rely on that for information, but it's also a source of concern. And they're also kind of they're relying on and trusting information sources, but with a sense of kind of skepticism as well.
Yeah, and this kind of correlates to research I was kind of doing 10 years before you were doing it in my own PhD, where I looked at some of this stuff as well. And yeah, this is kind of, as you kind of touched upon before, a weird juxtaposition between these kind of almost overtly positive attitudes towards the future. I'm going to do this in my life, and I'm going to travel there, and I'm going to become this. And then these kind of apocalyptic visions of like the future that they had about, at the time, climate change. In my work, there was also just post-September 11 and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But they weren't making a connection between the two.
Yes, that's exactly it. And the work that they do trying to make those connections is really interesting to me. So I'm interested in how they kind of rely on trust. So here's some kind of examples of trust-based coping strategies. The first one is, or the first two are, trusting that things will kind of continue on as they have, and trusting in some kind of sense of continuity. There was some discussion in the study as well about trusting in like the ability of those who are not so much those in positions of power, but those who are kind of knowledge holders in terms of like science and such, trusting in the ability to like have a sense of ingenuity and come up with some solutions to these really intractable problems that are facing us as a society.
Yeah. And you can see similar discourses today around the kind of technology will save us kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure Michael's all that trusting. He's just going to say he's going to be dead. So
yes, pretty much. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's the trust, and then there's kind of more hopeful discourses, I suppose.
Yeah. Yep. And so essentially there's a sense of kind of fragile hope. So a sense that some of these things are not really kind of working out. So Grace says that she's not really sure that they'll ever have an emissions trading scheme, not really sure that industries and such are going to stick to that. And there's also a kind of lack of trust in leaders, a sense of kind of generalized doom. But then, if we move on from that, we can see as well there's this kind of fragile sense of hope in the next generation. So not necessarily a large scale hope, but a sense of hope that, maybe their own children will do something to turn things around. Maybe they can kind of teach their children. And there's also this final point made by Isla about the need to have hope. Otherwise, there's no point. So we can see so clearly their hope as a strategy for coping, and hoping despite a lack of faith in large scale actors, and finding hope in these this sense of these specific individuals. So there was a lot of discussion of, as Elizabeth says, teaching children kind of sustainability, helping them to make good decisions, helping them to adopt eco-friendly lifestyles as a norm for them.
Yep. Okay. So one of the key things one of the key kind of findings of your research was this kind of, this struggle, this kind of juxtaposition, for want of a better word, between individuals' choices and plans, and that kind of hope and faith and the reality of things that they were facing. And, it's not just these large scale, huge existential risks like climate change and terrorism and things like that, but there's also kind of day-to-day stuff about, fragmented labour markets, not being able to buy a home, and all these kind of risks at a more individual level. So can you tell us a little bit about what you think today, the relationship between those things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of, I suppose, where I've headed with my own research, moving from looking at these quite theoretical concerns around futures to looking at much more pragmatic concerns around finances and housing, it's not really a mistake or not really just incidental. I think one of the biggest life course risks at present in Australia is not being a homeowner. So the biggest kind of risk of poverty in later life is not being a homeowner. The entire kind of retirement system in Australia is set up with the assumption that you own your own home, and the fact that that's increasingly out of reach for contemporary young people is creating this sense of disconnection from the future and uncertainty around the future that is in many ways reminiscent of kind of elements of the wider concerns, or the sentiments that arose through the wider concerns around the environment, climate change in my earlier research. So I think that these societal kind of large scale concerns and these individual life plans, I think they're coming into contact or coming into conflict more and more in contemporary times. And I think in some ways, just from the research that I've done with them, the contemporary young people I've spoken to perhaps have I suppose, some kind of ability to see the impact of kind of structural conditions in their everyday lives. So they're not necessarily blaming themselves for being unable to buy a house. They're cognizant of the structural challenges around that, and how the structural conditions have changed. And so I think that's interesting. It kind of is a bit of an evolution from the separate kind of societal and personal future, even though it's something as personal as a home, essentially.
Yep. Okay, so we're getting down to this first section, and I'm just summing up on that last slide there, relating it back to kind of figurative stuff that was presented earlier in the course. So what we're going to move on to now is talking about more specifically, I suppose, what we're getting at here, the kind of housing crisis in Australia and the way that relates to young people.
Fantastic.